thank you so much for joining us today at our first Lincoln at the Library for 2021. We are so grateful to the Friends of the Allen County Public Library for continuing to sponsor this series. And this year, we're especially appreciative to them because our 2021 series actually has 4 Lincoln at the Library presentations rather than our usual 3. So you'll get to see me 4 times this year. You can go ahead and mark your calendars for June 20th at 2 p.m. right here on Zoom for Dr. Hillary Green. She's a professor at the University of Alabama, and she will be presenting on African-American Civil War veterans from North Carolina. We really hope you'll be able to join us. There will be all sorts of advertising and everything on that, so you'll get your Zoom link and you can register just like you did for this program. But for today's program, we are so honored to have Jason Emerson with us virtually today from New York. Mr. Emerson is a journalist and independent historian who has written numerous books about the Lincoln family. He's been a Lincoln scholar for more than 25 years and has often been tapped to be the historical expert for book reviews, television shows, and various websites. Jason is a former National Park Service Ranger who worked numerous sites, including the Lincoln Home site in Springfield and the Gettysburg National Military Park. Today, Jason will be presenting on Mary Lincoln and her relationship with poetry. Before I let Jason on here real quick, reminder, if you do have any questions for him, we will have a Q&A at the end. Please feel free to put those in the chat below. And without further ado, Jason, if you'd like to turn your camera on and join us.
Hey, all right, thank you so much. Let's see here, I'm trying to find the speaker view. Okay. I hate computers. Anyways, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming and thank you for having me here. It is 28 degrees in Casanova, New York. So yeah, I gotta move out of here. I lived in Virginia for a while and it was much better. Anyways, Mary Lincoln in poetry. You know, on Valentine's Day, 1955, the Washington Star newspaper published a poem called Valentine for Mary Lincoln. And it was written by renowned poet Jane Merchant. And in case you've never read the poem or heard the poem, I will read it for you very quickly. It's very short. Forgive us, Mary, for the cruel lies we long believed of you, that you were only a nagging burden to the patient, wise, great-hearted man who bore the anguished, lonely weight of a warring nation. We have thought you gave him little help or tenderness, and with self-centered, angry tempers brought more sorrow to him in his great distress. We have grown wiser now. We know you gave him love and understanding without measure, and were warm-hearted, kind, and deeply brave. I write you this to tell you that we treasure your memory, and most of all, to tell you that we know at last he loved you well. Now, Jane Merchant, despite suffering from osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bones, being bedridden her entire life and going deaf at the age of 23, was one of the great poets of her generation. She refused to be hindered by her physical condition and was active in literary circles her entire life. She was a prolific writer of more than 3,000 poems, over 2,000 letters, dozens of prose pieces, and 10 published collections of poetry, and won numerous awards. Now, she told historian Ruth Painter Randall that her inspiration for her poem, Valentine for Mary Lincoln, came after reading Randall's 1953 book, Mary Lincoln, Biography of a Marriage. Randall later reprinted Merchant's poem in her children's book about Mary Lincoln, stating, "The very fact that such a poem has been written is a heartwarming sign that at last justice to Mary has been done." Now, my intention in writing 5 books and over a dozen articles about Mary Lincoln over the last 10 or 15 years or so has never been to do Mary justice. I don't believe that is necessarily the job of a historian. I think my job is to explain her life and times and to seek to understand Mary for the fascinating and complicated woman that she was, and who also happened to be the wife of one of the greatest Americans and men of all time. And I've always loved poetry. I've written poetry, I've published poems myself in magazines, and I believe that looking at a historical figure through the lens of poets and the poetry they write can be a unique and revelatory experience. Irish poet Seamus Heaney said at the end of the 20th century that poetry is not only a matter of proffered argument and edifying content, but a matter of angelic potential, emotion of the soul. And perhaps that's the allure of poetry. It offers everyone an inspirational way to perceive the world. And this is one of the many reasons I wrote my book, Lincoln's Lover, Mary Lincoln in Poetry, Shameless Self-Promotion. You can see a little stack of my books right there over my shoulder. Take a good look. Now, interestingly, a love of poetry is one of the passions that young Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln shared when they first met and as they were courting. Most people know that as a young man, Abraham Lincoln wrote poems and even published poems. And all of his greatest writings, in my opinion, and many other people's opinions, are themselves inherently poetic, like the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural. And the poetry that Lincoln loved and read throughout his life and its influence on him forms a major part of every biographical study of him. Now, for Mary Todd, as a young girl, growing up in a wealthy, influential family, her father was a banker and a politician in Lexington, Mary showed a predilection and a passion for poetry from a young age. She had 12 years of formal schooling, more than pretty much all women at that time, and actually more schooling than most men had at that time. And she was well read in classic literature. She found a great pleasure and even a solace in verse. Her cousin remembered that as a young girl, Mary's, quote, love for poetry, which she was forever reciting, was the cause of many a jest among her friends. Page after page of classic poetry she could recite and liked nothing better. And the bookshelves of the Todd home where Mary grew up were well stocked with volumes of poetry by Robert Burns, Lord Byron, Shakespeare, Pope, numerous other classics. And Mary and Abraham would often read poetry, recite, and discuss poetry together, both during their courtship and after their marriage. Mary was an earnest and voracious reader, and she liked to, what she called, review many of the volumes for her husband. Her younger sister, Emily Todd Helm, recalled, she said, quote, I heard Abraham say he had no need to read a book after Mary gave him a synopsis. And some of the known books of poetry that were owned by the Lincolns in their home in Springfield included the works of Robert Burns, Eliza Cook, Oliver Goldsmith, and of course, William Shakespeare. They had an anthology of female American poets and a collection of elegant extracts of poetry by the Reverend Vicemius. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, Vicemius Fox. Mary was also a subscriber to the Southern Literary Messenger, which was a literary periodical. Now, most people know the Lincolns, they courted, they were engaged, and they broke up, which is its own story. 18 months after that broken engagement, a lot of people don't know that it was a poem that helped bring the estranged couple back together. And it also nearly caused Abraham Lincoln to fight a duel. In late 1842, a series of 4 satirical letters were published in the Sangamo Journal in Springfield, Illinois, and they were supposedly written by a woman named Rebecca, an uneducated but shrewd backwoods woman from a place called the Lost Townships. And these letters ridiculed the Democrat state auditor named James Shields, for his political maneuvers concerning bank and tax issues. Now, Whig State Assemblyman Abraham Lincoln wrote at least one of the Rebecca letters, probably more. And at this time, he and Mary Todd had been reconciling from their previous broken engagement. And he showed this letter that he wrote to Mary and her friend Julia Jane. And the girls got in on it and they wrote their own piece to this series of letters. Now, while the other letters that Lincoln wrote, they ridiculed James Shields' politics, the letter written by Mary and her friend actually debauched Shields personally. And the final installment of these letters was a poem, and it was signed with the name Kathleen, and it just ridiculed Shields mercilessly, and it celebrated his marriage to the rough-hewn Rebecca, who was short, fat, and old, among other things they said. And Shields was so incensed that he accosted the newspaper editor, demanded to know the identity of the author. Lincoln, being very chivalrous, took responsibility. Shields demanded an immediate public retraction, which Lincoln refused, so Shields challenged him to a duel. Now, Lincoln accepted, and as the challenged party, he got to choose the weapons, so he chose broadswords. And he later said, "I did not want to kill him, but if I had to, I would have split him from crown to foot," which I think Lincoln would have done easily because he was 7 inches taller than Shields and therefore had a much longer reach with his arms. Now, at the very last minute, friends of both of them got them to retract their statements, shake hands, and they all went home as friends. Now, as a side note, the famous Shields duel incident, it humiliated Abraham Lincoln, and he and Mary agreed never to discuss it ever. But in February 1865, an Army officer heard the tale and asked President Lincoln if the story of the duel was true, as the officer said, "All for the sake of the lady by your side." Lincoln, flushed with embarrassment, he replied, "I do not deny it, but if you desire my friendship, you will never mention it again." Now, I'm not going to read the Kathleen poem. It is in my book. It's really not good poetry. It's political satire, but it is the only poem that we know that Mary wrote, or at least helped to write, her and Julia Jane, but I think Mary wrote the whole thing herself, and it's the only one. And actually, that 1842 poem is not even the earliest poem in my book of poems by, for, and about Mary Lincoln. The first one is from about 1839, and it's called "Riding on a Dray." And if you've read much about Lincoln and Mary, you may have heard of this before. And the poem comes from a true incident that occurred when a very young Mary Todd and her friend Mercy Levering went out into the town of Springfield after weeks of heavy rains. The girls had been stuck in the house because of the constant rains, which had turned all the unpaved streets in Springfield to mud. So finally, Mary had had enough, and she had this great idea, and she grabbed a bundle of shingles. And what they did was they started at the Edwards home, Mary's sister and brother-in-law, and they were dropping the shingles in the mud so they could hop their way across until they got to the sidewalks downtown. Now, either the shingles ran out or the girls just got tired because they kind of got stuck. So Mary hailed a man named Ellis Hart, who was the driver of a two-wheeled wagon called a dray. And she asked for a ride back to the Edwards home. Now, drays were for hauling goods, not people, and Mercy refused to ride in it. She was afraid of the scandal it would cause because it was so uncouth for well-bred girls of their position, so well-dressed, to be riding in a dray. Now, Mary didn't care, so she hopped on board. Now, a young man named Dr. E.H. Merriman, who moved in the same social circles as the girls, he saw this, and he actually composed a poem about it, which was circulated around the town. And it's very long. I'm just going to read two stanzas of it, but it starts off by saying, "As I walked out Monday last, a wet and muddy day, 'twas there I saw a pretty lass a-riding on a dray. Quoth I, sweet lass, what do you there? Said she, good lack a day, I had no coach to take me home, so I'm riding on a dray. Up flew windows, out popped heads, to see this lady gay, in a silken cloak and feathers white, a-riding on a dray. At length arrived at Edward's gate, Hart back the usual way, and taking out the iron pin, he rolled her off the dray." Now, that poem actually was kept by, I think, Mercy Levering's family for 80 or more years before it was ever public knowledge. Now, these are just two of the earliest poems that I found about Mary Lincoln. And I honestly, I don't remember how I started this book. I've always loved poetry. And the first two articles I ever wrote or published about Abraham Lincoln were about his poetry, his love for poetry, and the poetry that he wrote. He wrote multiple poems. And there are, in fact, multiple books of poems that he wrote that people combined into little tiny books. And there's a lot of books of collected poems that is written about Abraham Lincoln. Now, immediately after the assassination, hundreds of poetic tributes to Lincoln were published in newspapers across the country. A number of these poems were collected and published that year in 1865 as poetical tributes to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. And some of the greatest poets in America wrote them as well. Now, since then, the art of portraying and praising Lincoln in verse has never stopped. Multiple books of collections of poetry about Lincoln have been published. I have them all right back behind me here. 1911, there was one called The Praise of Lincoln. There was The Poet's Lincoln in 1915, The Book of Lincoln in 1919, and Lincoln and the Poets in 1965, which was kind of in honor of the 100th anniversary of his assassination. I actually considered doing my own collection of such poems in 2015 at the 150th anniversary of the assassination. But yeah, publishers weren't interested. You know, poetry is hard to sell, history is hard to sell, and when you put them both together, it's really hard to sell. And I was saying before this started, it was hard to get this book published, actually. But you know, this idea, this might have been where I got my idea for Lincoln's Lover. The second article, excuse me, I ever wrote was an examination of a poem called Little Eddie, which is connected to the death of the Lincoln's second son, Edward Baker Lincoln. A line from the poem is on Eddie's tombstone, and the poem itself was published in the newspaper, I think it was the day after Eddie's funeral. But no one ever knew who wrote the poem. And, you know, did Abraham write it? Did Mary write it? Did someone else? Nobody knew. So I wrote an article, and I actually did not have an opinion. I just said, here's the poem, here's the history. Lincoln could have written it, here's why. Mary could have written it, here's why. Or maybe someone else did, I don't know. My thought was Lincoln wrote it. Mary would have been too distraught to do it. But it was actually proven a few years ago by state historian Sam Wheeler that neither of the Lincolns wrote it. It was a previously existing poem that somebody found and put in the paper in honor of Little Eddie. Now that story of Little Eddie is in my book as well, if anyone's interested in that. So, you know, somewhere along the line of all this history work I've done, I decided to just seek out and collect every poem written by, for, or about Mary Lincoln that I could find. And it took me about 5 years, a lot of archival digging, because honestly, only a couple of poems in this book are well known or easy to find. The rest took a long time. And in the end, I came up with works spanning from 1839 to 2012. There's rhymed metered poetry all the way to the loosest of free verse, and they cover all aspects of Mary's life. There's poems in there about her as a wife and a mother, about her time as First Lady, about her as a bereaved widow, and even as her typical role of a historical villain. Now, one of Mary's most conspicuous legacies, whether people like it or not, is that she was a woman who went insane during her life. And what I found interesting was that almost all the poems written about Mary in the late 20th and early 21st centuries all focus on her mental health and her commitment to the sanitarium in 1875. But you know, for me, there's so many fascinating aspects of this book. The poems, the poets who wrote them, and the parts of Mary's life being memorialized. The last poem that I found for the book was the one that took me the longest to find. It was a stinging 1862 satire of Mary Lincoln, published in the Philadelphia Sunday Dispatch newspaper, and it's called The Queen Must Dance. And it took me a long time to find it. The poem is a harsh rebuke of Mary Lincoln's decision to hold an invitation-only presidential ball while the country was in the midst of a civil war and soldiers were suffering on the battlefields and in the field hospitals. And it was written by a playwright at the time, and he didn't put his name, of course, on the poem, but his name was George Boker. And I found at first a lot of people, well, not a lot, I found a few people who mentioned the poem and how correct it was. But, you know, to actually find the name of the writer took a little digging, but fascinating poem, very long poem. Now, to me, the most amazing story that I found through all of this, there was a poem written in 1865 called Mrs. Lincoln's Lamentation. And this was written right after the assassination. And it's really just, you know, honoring Mary, commiserating with Mary, the fact that her husband was murdered. It's a very moving poem, and it was written by a gentleman named George Moses Horton. But what's really interesting is that George Moses Horton was a black man. But more than that, he was a slave. He was, in fact, the only man in US history to publish a book while he was held in bondage. And he was in North Carolina. And so what he would do, he was actually illiterate, and he would compose poetry in his head. So his very first book, he composed in his head, he recited it to a white woman. She wrote it down and helped him get the book published. Now, Horton was a slave. So instead of working in the cotton fields, his master was, I would say, a smart man, and he decided to use George's talents. So George would go to Duke University and set up in front of the doors with a chair and a table. And he would offer to write poetry for the college students for, I think it was a quarter a pop. So he would actually do their homework for them and write them poetry on the spot, and for which they'd pay him. And then of course he gave all of his money back to his master because he was a slave. And it's amazing. Ultimately, George Moses Horton learned how to read and write, and he published more books of poetry that he did it all himself. He didn't have to have someone translate it for him onto the written word. And he did get his freedom after the war. But it's an amazing poem that he wrote. It's very, very 1860s, very Victorian, flowery language. But it's fascinating to think. I had never known about this gentleman. I've been studying poetry my whole life, and I'd never heard of him until I started working on this book. But I have to say, I think the most impressive poet that I found in working on this was a woman named Della Crowder Miller, again, whom I've never heard of. In 1965, she published a truly astonishing 3-volume Life of Abraham Lincoln, which she wrote completely in verse, and within which were a number of poems specifically about Mary Lincoln, excuse me, or a number of poems mention Mary secondarily. Miller said the book took her 9 years, and she decided to do a biography in, actually not just poetry, in sonnets, in a sonnet sequence. And she said she did that because she felt that sonnets were the highest form of literature, and because a love of poetry was such a part of Abraham Lincoln's life. Now, any poet, any writer who's ever attempted to write a sonnet, whether Shakespearean or Petrarchan, knows they're really hard to do if it's done right. And Miller's poems they're interesting. The history is accurate. Her whole book, the feelings, tone, and settings she describes are all well done. The poems are pretty pedestrian, but she's trying more to impart information than looking for soaring emotion or to inspire people with high language. But I included 2 of her poems in my book. One is called Mary Lincoln Visits Lexington, and the other one is called Mrs. Lincoln Given Social Snubs, which are about 2 very interesting times in Mary's life. The first one was when she took the young boys and her husband to visit her family in Lexington for the first time. And the other was about the way the women of Washington treated Mary when she was First Lady, especially when they first arrived in Washington. Now, of everything that I've compiled in my book, my favorite poem is called Lady of Lincoln by Marion Mills Miller. And Miller was actually an academic, and he wrote or edited a number of works about Abraham Lincoln. I believe he was a professor. I actually could not find the original version of this poem. I could only find it anthologized in the 1930s. But it's a very short poem, so I'm going to read it for you because it is one of my favorites, and I feel like it perfectly encapsulates Mary Lincoln as a person and her reputation. Lady of Lincoln, little bride whose love uplifted his fallen pride. Lady of Lincoln, loyal mate whose faith in his greatness made him great. Lady of Lincoln, patriot soul whose love of country embraced the whole. Lady of Lincoln, they wreathed her head with thorns when living, with nettles though dead. Now, since we've just passed Valentine's Day, and we started with a Valentine's poem, I'd like to finish up with some thoughts on the Lincolns as a couple, the Lincoln love story. Unlike many of my colleagues in the Lincoln world, I believe that the Lincolns truly and deeply loved each other. I think they were a perfect fit, and Abraham Lincoln understood his wife thoroughly. And there are many comments from them both recalled by their friends and their family that attest to this. When a man once asked Lincoln why he let his wife yell at him so much, especially in Springfield, Mary's on record yelling at Lincoln, berating him, supposedly beating him with a broom or a piece of firewood, some of which I believe, some of which I don't. But either way, she definitely liked to yell a lot. And this man asked Lincoln, why would you let her yell at you? Why are you so henpecked? And Lincoln said, if you knew how much good it does to her and how little harm it does me, you would not wonder that I am meek. During the war years, Lincoln supposedly told General Daniel Sickles, when the general was complimenting Mrs. Lincoln, Abraham supposedly said, my wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I, a poor nobody then, fell in love with her And what is more, I have never fallen out. But one of my favorite letters that Mary ever wrote, a couple of years after her husband's death, she was talking about her husband, and she said, "He was from my 18th year, husband, lover, father, brother, all to me, truly my all." And, I think that's true. They had their ups and downs like every couple does, but I really think they loved each other. And of course, the war years, if you think about what they both went through, that's kind of an extraordinary thing for a couple to get through. But, a couple of my favorite poems in my book and that I ever found about Mary Lincoln are about the Lincolns as a married couple, but not just about two people who share a house and share children, but as a man and a woman, as lovers, as sensual beings. Dan Guillory, who's a wonderful poet from Springfield, Illinois, here's his book called The Lincoln Poems, which I highly recommend. He captured this perfectly in two poems that I included in my book. One is called Litany for Mary T, and one is called Love is Eternal. And in both of these poems, Guillory writes in the voice of Abraham Lincoln, a man smitten with his wife, his lover. "Oh, terrible she, angel fat goddess, my tormenting demon in black-toed slippers, my dancing accordion." Guillory writes in Litany for Mary T, "She of the 7 petticoats and the slit open drawers, eyes fierce as a lynx, nakedness all musk and mink. Oh, she of the burning gaze, the up-curled lip, the little finger hooked behind my ear, that hitching post of love." Now in the poem Love is Eternal, Guillory, again in Lincoln's voice, he writes a little less sensuously and a little bit more endearingly. "Sweet Mary, I am schoolboy at your side, student of the bound volume abundant with information. The theme, the meaning develops as a series of impressions under my fingertips. A little crease here, some dog-eared flap, gently thumbing the well-tooled spine. There is reassurance in the familiar, sadness at the inevitable ending, and perfect pleasure reading it again as if for the very first time." And this is who Mary was. She was a complete person, full of virtues, full of foibles, a woman who lived as best she could, and who became a part of history as the wife of Abraham Lincoln. And as I said, I think the Lincolns loved each other very deeply and had their ups and downs. And to me, there's no better testament to their love than the inscription on Mary's wedding ring, which is the same as the title of the poem I just read, which says, "Love is eternal." And I think that that is just one of the numerously interesting ways that Mary has been portrayed throughout history by historians, but also by the poets. And I do think if you look at her through the eyes of poets, you will see Mary in a different way and maybe appreciate her a little bit more and understand that historical figures are still people and nobody's perfect. And sometimes we all just deserve a little bit of understanding. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. That was fascinating.
Oh,
I
thank you.
think Mary's a very, very interesting character for a multitude of reasons, but really seeing her in poetry is almost an entirely different person than most of us that just studied her in history class really get.
Right.
We do have a couple of questions that have already come in. And for everybody else, please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I will get to them in the order that they come in. So just give me a second to get to yours. I believe our first one you kind of answered a little bit, but I think there's a really interesting note in this. Is Mary Lincoln known to have written any poetry, which I believe you did address. Is yes, she's the
Just
poet
that
one
that we're aware of.
Right. And then the continuation was, I know her husband wrote several poems and wondered if his interest in poetry influenced her at all. Can you talk about them influencing each other with poetry?
I think that they definitely, I think they both loved poetry already before they met. And that was one of the things that brought them together. But I think they clearly influenced each other. As I said, and as most people know, they were both voracious readers of poetry, literature, history. Well, not Abraham Lincoln didn't like history, but of general literature. And Abraham Lincoln, especially during the war, one of the things he would do to ease his stress and ease his mind would be to read Shakespeare, read poetry, read the Bible. And Mary always, and when she became First Lady, she was given $250 to improve the White House library. And she bought, there's a list of everything she bought, lots of books of poetry, many books that Abraham Lincoln liked as well. Of course, she bought a brand new edition of Shakespeare, I think of Robert Burns as well. And so I think that they did read together, discuss books when they could. Of course, during the war, they were hardly together. Lincoln was running the war. Mary was typically traveling and shopping and doing her own thing. So, but it definitely, I would say, kind of influenced is the word I would use, but it was definitely a shared passion that was one of the points of their marriage.
Oh, definitely. And I think that goes to your point also about them as a couple being actually a good fit, that they do have this shared interest together that they can discuss and talk about, and that
Right.
Mary's at like almost an even playing level with him,
Right.
interacting with it, which is highly unusual for this period.
Right.
We have a comment. Her son Willie wrote some poetry, I guess.
He did.
What did Willie write? I'm genuinely curious.
His poems in my book too. Willie wrote, this was in 1860, I guess this probably would have been 61. Sure, now I can't find it. But yeah, it's in my book. But yes, Willie, he was, kind of the spitting image of his father in many ways. And he loved poetry as well. So when Edward Boker, who was the namesake for Eddie Lincoln, he was killed at, I think it was the Battle of Ball's Bluff, I believe, in 1861. Willie wrote a poem about Colonel Boker, and it was published in the Washington Intelligencer newspaper, I believe, signed by Willie. It wasn't anonymous. It was, something to the effect of, hey, the son of President Lincoln is quite a kid, and hey, here's a poem he wrote. And it's very interesting, and it's actually quite a good poem for probably 10 or 11 when he wrote it. But yeah, that is the only one that we're aware of that Willie wrote. Although again, just like Mary, I wouldn't be surprised if he wrote others, just as I'm sure Mary wrote others. We just have never seen them. And one major cause is when they were leaving Springfield to go to Washington, Mary did a typical Victorian house cleaning, and there is eyewitness accounts of her burning family papers. That some of the few love letters we have between the Lincolns were because a neighbor saved them from the fire. That she said, "Oh my gosh, can I have those?" And Mary said, "I don't care, go ahead, take them." Everything else Mary burned. So I'm sure there were other things like that in there as well.
Sure. As a historian and archivist, everyone who's going to do spring cleaning soon, please don't do that. Please save your letters and your poems and your sticky notes, because we like them and someone might write a book about it one day.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one here. The name of the book of poetry from Springfield, I believe, is that?
The Lincoln Poems by Dan Guillory. And he is actually, this was from, I think, 07. He has another book that came out, I don't know, maybe in 2012, of which there were also many other poems about Abraham and Mary that I was near the end of production for my book, so I did not fit them in, but I had already given him 2 poems, so I didn't want to go too crazy. But
that's fair. Supposed to ask you if you can provide any links to where your published poetry may be found, and with that, where can people find your books?
Wow. Okay. Well, all of my books are, excuse me, they're all available on Amazon.com. I actually have an author page on Amazon, so if you search my name, you should be able to find them. And I also have 2 ebooks as well that are basically articles I published years ago that were published into little books. My website, jasonemerson.com, has all my books and articles listed. 5 of my books were published through Southern Illinois University Press. So if you go there, you can find 5 of them. As far as my poetry, that was back in the day. When I was in high school and college, poetry was that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a published poet and just do poetry. And so I published, I don't know, 6 or 10 poems maybe in various literary magazines across the nation. No major publications, you know. I think my first was in a magazine called Mobius, like Red River Review was one, and The Rectangle. So no major, I'm sure this was so long ago. I'm sure they didn't have websites back then. And if these publications are still around and still have websites, I don't even know if my poems would come up. But oh, you know what? Shameless plug. I did write a poem that is in here that I wrote for Mary Lincoln. I didn't mean to do it, but as I was writing this book, I kind of got inspired. So I wrote a poem kind of my own feelings on Mary Lincoln. And I thought it turned out surprisingly well. So I put it in the book. And the former poet laureate of Kentucky, Maureen Moorhead, wrote the foreword for this book. And as I was, oh no, I'm sorry, it wasn't her. It was, I think, Juliana Baggett wrote one of the poets in here read my poem, and she said, "I think you're a little bit in love with Mary Lincoln." I said, "Well, maybe I am. Just don't tell my fiance." But you know, Mary's dead, so it's okay. So, well, I can't hear you, Emily, for some reason. Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Hey, there it is.
Gosh, it feels like those old cell phone commercials. I was glad you mentioned Mary, the poem that you wrote about Mary in your book, because I was going to out you and say, no, you have been published. Your poetry is in a big publication.
Yes. Should I read it? I see a comment there that says, "Do you want to read it?"
We'll get there. Hold on.
Okay.
I think we will have some time. Absolutely. Where did Mary go to school is our next question.
Oh boy, you guys are going to test my memory now. So she went to Madame Mantells School, was where she first went for a number of years. And there she learned, you know, French and literature. And I think they also did dancing and, you know, kind of the typical things that women were supposed to know back then. She did that for a number of years, and then she did a year or two off, and then she went back and did what today would kind of be considered graduate work or postgraduate work with, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman who ran the school. I'm sure many people on this call, Pam Brown, I know definitely probably knows who that is. I apologize, I'm forgetting his name right now. But yeah, she went to 2 different schools. And, you know, one was only down the street from the Todd home. And yet Mary actually lived at the school, which I think gives great credence to the fact that, you know, there's some evidence to show that Mary was miserable at home, mostly because of her stepmother, whom she did not really get along with. Reverend Ward, thank you. That was it. Carolyn, thank you. And so Mary only came home on weekends, even though it was literally only a couple of blocks away. So I think that shows something about Mary's home life, not to mention that she was one of, what, 12 children at the time in the home, plus slaves and visitors and family visitors. And so she would rather have stayed at the school, which is very interesting. So, yeah, and I think, you know, Mary's education, she was a brilliant woman. And that's one of the reasons so many people in Washington disliked her, because not only was she as smart or smarter than them, she didn't hide it. You know, she would jump into a conversation with a man, and the men back then didn't like it because she was a woman who didn't know her place. And so Mary had a lot of faults and a lot of foibles, but, you know, not everything that happened to her was her fault. And that's one. That was just pure male bias against her at that point.
Well, that answered one of the other questions that I think we got through email, which was, why did everyone dislike Mary so much? She's very unusual for her time period and very outspoken.
Yeah.
And I do think that does make her and Lincoln that good fit.
Yes, exactly. And she also, you know, but also all the women of Washington disliked her as well. I think Ruth Painter Randall really said it best, was that no matter what Mary did, she just could not win. when she was first lady, because, you know, when they were from Illinois. So everyone in the East thought that she was some stupid hick rube from out in Illinois. All the Northerners thought she was a traitor because she was from Kentucky. They thought she was a rebel. And all the Southerners thought she was a traitor because she was from Kentucky, but she's married to the president and she's vying for the North. And everybody in DC just didn't like her because she was not one of them. She was not a DC insider, because back then, just like today, congressmen and senators, that was their career, even though it was never meant to be a career. So they all lived in DC, and she was an outsider. So no matter what she did, she couldn't win. You know, I firmly believe that had there been no war, which Mary was perfectly unsuited to be first lady during a war, if it had just been like the 1840s or 50s or whatever, I think Mary Lincoln today would be considered one of the greatest first ladies we've ever had. She was intelligent, she was witty, she could hold a conversation, but she knew how to dress, she knew how to dance, she knew how to decorate, she knew how to talk politics. She was perfectly suited for that role, but not during a civil war. And she could not handle that. But, you know, when she first got to Washington, all the women tried to tell her how she should do her job. And she resented that immensely and basically told them all to go, you know, take a hike. So then they didn't like her for that. And then the people who didn't like her just because of who she was. So really nobody liked her. And, you know, part of it was because she wouldn't play the game. And then part of it was because of her own temper and her own bad manners at times as well. So
I know it's not easy to decipher from history, but what precipitating events triggered Mary's mental illness?
Well, you know, lots of different opinions on that. My first book, which is The Madness of Mary Lincoln, is an examination of Mary's mental health from childhood all the way to death. And I consulted with multiple psychiatric experts because I'm not a doctor. And I feel that it was an inherited trait. You know, in the Todd family, I found 14 members of her family that had mental illness. So it was an inherited trait. You know, all the way when she was a child, people said, oh, Mary was like an April day, one day raining, one day sunning all over. You know, in Springfield, it was common for people to say that Mary Lincoln was either in the garret or the cellar, and she could change just like that on a dime. And then when Eddie died, she went into a horrible depression, as any mother would. But, you know, it got to the point where she wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep, she wouldn't change her clothes. And finally, Abraham Lincoln had to plead with her, you know, Mary, you must eat, for we must live. Then she got better. They had 2 more boys, things were going well. And then Willie died in 1862, and Mary spiraled downward. Same thing, she wouldn't eat or sleep or leave her room, and Lincoln had to plead with her. And actually, there's a great story that I often tell, that he took Mary to the window of the White House and pointed across the river to an insane asylum, sanitarium. And he said, Mother, do you see that building? If you do not control your grief, it will drive you mad, and we will have to send you there. And it's interesting that comes from Elizabeth Keckley from her 1866 book. This was long before the cult of Lincoln, which is why I believed the story. And it shows that Abraham Lincoln was actually the first person to suggest Mary might need institutionalization one day. So Mary got better. Then her husband died, and then she got worse. Just as she started getting a little better, then Tad died. And I personally think Tad's death is what pushed her over the edge, which ultimately led to her getting committed to the sanitarium. But, you know, I mean, I've written 5 books about Mary. They all talk about this because I personally believe that is a integral part of who Mary was. So you cannot talk about her life if you don't discuss her mental health, her family history, things like that. So.
Oh, here's a fun one. Were there any novels in the Lincoln home? Supposedly, Mr. L didn't go for fiction.
Yeah, he did not read a lot of fiction. Mary loved fiction, and so did Robert. So yeah, there are, you know, the Lincoln Home historical inventory report, I believe it's called, might even be available online. That lists all the books that were in the house that they know of. Then there's the White House books I mentioned, and actually Robert's house, Hildene, has a lot of his own books, his college textbooks, and a number of books from the Lincoln home that he kept with him. They have a couple that Mary signed, actually. So there were some novels. I know Mary and Robert loved Charles Dickens. There's a great story of them reading, was it Ivanhoe, I think, and Robert acting it out in the street, and Mary, or the Lady of the Lake or something like that, and Mary shouting out the window, "Oh, Gramercy, brave knight, pray be more worthy than you are brawny," something like that. So now Mary loved reading to the children. They loved to read books. And, she, probably the book everybody reads more than anything is about Mary is Mary Todd Lincoln, a biography by Jean Baker, which I think is a book nobody should ever read. However, Baker, I think, has one great point in it. And she says, basically, Mary Lincoln in Springfield was a single mother. And that's true. Lincoln was always gone 8 to 9 months of the year. So Mary, a lot of people don't realize she educated the children until they started going to school. And so one of the big things she did during that education was to give them a great basis in literature and poetry.
I'm going to jump questions real quick because this goes on to what you just said. So you mentioned the biography that everyone reads of Mary. What
Yes.
biography do you suggest of Mary?
Good question. My favorite, so there's a number of good books about Mary. My favorite, I still think the best one ever written about her was written in 1932 by W.A. Evans. It's called Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, A Study of Her Personality. And there's a much longer title. That's, it's a very long Victorian title. You can find it used online, but actually Southern Illinois University Press, I convinced them to reprint it. And I wrote a new foreword for the book, and that came out, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. And it's in paperback. So if you want to read his book, you can get it relatively cheaply online or through SIU Press. And I wrote a little foreword to talk about him. The bad thing about that book, so in that book, Evans, he wrote the book because he wanted to understand Mary Lincoln. That was his whole point, was to understand who she was. And so he actually spoke and interviewed a number of Todd family members who were still alive, some of the people who were friends with Mary who were still alive. And he talked to Emily Helm. I believe he looked through her diary. There's stuff in his book that is not available anyplace else because he talked to people who are dead, or he found writings that no longer exist. It is dated, but I still think it's the best because I think it's an objective book. Everything else that's come since then is not objective. Ruth Bader Randall's book is a very good book, but she's trying to defend Mary, and she says it outright. Her whole point of writing the book is to rehabilitate Mary's reputation. So she ignores a lot and excuses a lot. Jean Baker's book, the first half honestly is very good. It's the best book for learning about the context in which she grew up and her life and her family, being a woman at that time. But then after the assassination, the whole book skews into a political polemic that is also just fraught with errors and inaccuracies. And I honestly don't recommend it to people. The most recent book by Catherine Clinton is not even worth time looking at, personally, I think. So don't even bother with that one. Actually, a new one that came out was by Stacey Pratt McDermott. Great book. It's very short, it's very brief, and it's meant to be a brief overview of Mary's life. So it's part of a series of, brief bios of famous women or something like that. And it's wonderful, but it's meant to be brief. So it is very brief, but I find it's incredibly objective, always accurate. And that's a great little book to buy. But no, I'm still waiting for a great bio of Mary. I toyed with the idea of writing one myself, but I don't know. I'm not feeling it. I'm still recovering from 10 years writing my biography of Robert Lincoln. So
I was going to say, you've already done one in the Lincoln family. Just do another one. That's only 10 more years, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we've got just a couple more questions. We might go a little past our 3 o'clock because we did start just a tiny bit late.
Sure.
Mary loved to speak French. Did you find any French poems associated with Mary?
I did not. I found supposedly there was a French poem from, it was a poem written about Mary in French in 1866, I believe it was. Mary Lincoln was given a medal from the people of France, and it was paid for by, it was a penny subscription, and all these people of France donated a penny so that they had this beautiful medallion of gold made. And it was, they had a committee, they came from France to Chicago, presented it to Mary Lincoln. It's a wonderful story. A lot of people don't know. I actually wrote an article about it because it had never really been written about before. And at the same time, and I think because of this medal, which was written about in the papers at the time, supposedly a Frenchman wrote a poem about Mary in French. And I tried for years to find that. But unfortunately, all I ever found was, one brief or two brief mentions that it existed. But I don't know who wrote it, where it came from, where it was published. So I was never able to find it. But I've never seen or heard of anything that Mary ever wrote in French. We know she spoke French, especially to Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts. The two of them spoke French together all the time as a way to kind of keep their skills up.
What types of genre of poetry did Mary most enjoy, and who were her favorite poets?
Interesting. Well, Mary, I think she liked all poetry. Let me see here. I have some notes here that I can look for. It's interesting that in both the Springfield home of the Lincolns and in the White House, she purposefully bought poetry by women, which I think is great, which surprised me because especially back then, there was not as much poetry written by women as there is today. But the fact that they actually had those books, and it is written that they had those books, I found that fascinating. She loved Robert Burns, just like her husband. She loved Shakespeare, just like her husband. Honestly, most of the books of poetry in the Lincoln home and in the White House were authors I've never heard of. It was like Fitz Green Halleck was one. One was Albert Layton, I believe his name was. Was a friend of Robert's in college, came to the White House to visit during a vacation, and he was friends with the poet Albert Layton. And he wrote a little article about it, and he said, I went to the White House and I heard Mrs. Lincoln reading poetry, and I said, a fellow lover of poetry. And so he gave Mary a copy of his friend's book of poetry, which she was very, very thrilled to have. And she read through it immediately, and it was part of the White House book collection after that. That's a great little article. It's only like a page or two long. I think it's called something like Mary Lincoln Lover of Poetry or something. It's in my annotated bibliography of Mary called Mary Lincoln for the Ages. It's in there somewhere. But yeah, it's honestly a lot of the poetry books that we know she read are people I've honestly never really heard of. So they must have, obviously they were popular at the time, but they are not people who have endured through today.
Sure. I think we've got one more that came in via email, and I just love to ask this, especially of authors and poets. Are you working on anything now, and what's your next project?
Next book is supposed to be out in about 2 months. It is non-Lincoln. I live in Cazenovia, New York, which is a wonderful little town, and it is a book of history vignettes of the interesting people and events in our town. So for example, each chapter is a different story. One of the chapters is a gentleman who lived here, who was president of the local college. He has a connection to Abraham Lincoln that I found. He met Lincoln. He knew some things about Lincoln that were later incorporated into books. And he has Lincoln's autograph, and his father has a great Lincoln story. So that's one. There's an article about a woman from Cazenovia. At the time, she was called the bravest woman in the world, Lucia Zora Card. She was an elephant tamer and a lion tamer for the circus. She was world famous at the time. She was from my town. You know, there was Revolutionary War heroes. There was a Civil War soldier who escaped from Andersonville prison and wrote about his entire story. So that's in there. So there's all these World War I stories, World War II. The gentleman who wrote one of my all-time favorite novels, The Oxbow Incident, he was a teacher at Cazenovia High School when he wrote that book. So it's all that, and I had a co-author, and we did it together. So that'll be out soon. After that, you know, I honestly don't have any books in the works. I've got a couple of articles. I just found a Lincoln artifact in the region where I live here that I had never heard of, didn't know existed. I contacted some of my fellow Lincoln people, and including the former curator at the Presidential Library. No one has ever heard of it or even knows this thing exists. So I'm writing that article. As you can tell, I'm being very cagey about it. It's super exciting. It's really, so I'm writing that up. That's what I'm doing right now to get that out. I had a couple other things, and you know, I don't know what I'm going to do for my next book. I'm thinking of taking a break from Lincoln World, and I have many other book ideas. I've also been writing historical fiction, so I might go in that way. Fiction actually sells, you know. I might actually be able to make money off it. So that's a nice change.
I say we can't fault you for that. Absolutely not. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. Reminder to everyone, this has been recorded. We will be putting it up on our archival site, so you can find that through our page at the Allen County Public Library or at lincolncollection.org. You can also see upcoming events like our next Lincoln at the Library that will be happening on June 20th at our Friends of the Lincoln Collection.org. You will see all of that listed there. You'll also see us on our social media, Lincoln Collection on Facebook. I know many of you already follow us and shared everything today for Jason, so thank you so much. And we hope we will see you all in June. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.